what AI does is imitate the temp. It's counterfeit art. It's just mimics. But something that purely mimics can't actually do the thing we want out of art, which is to give us something like original and interesting and something that's sort of like in a way based on experience.
This is Joseph Ring. I'm a cattle feedlot operator in Northern Illinois, and you're listening to the Vance Crow Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today, we have Erik Hoel back on the podcast. Erik is as prolific and insightful as ever, and I'm really excited for you to check it out. We are moving into a new studio. If you are interested in hiring me to interview one of your loved ones about their life experiences, go to store.articulate.ventures to find out more about the legacy interviews. All right, without further ado, let's head into this interview with Erik Hoel. Erik Hoel, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Happy to be returning.
Man, your book has caught the world on fire. When we first were talking, the book had just come out in like preprint. And what is the world of being an established, recognized author like for you?
Well, I mean, I would say I sort of have a complex relationship with the publishing industry. I mean, I like every big industry. It has its sort of structures that you have to learn how to navigate. And I grew up in an independent bookstore that my mother owned, so I sold books my whole life. But lately, I've switched to writing online, and I write a Substack called The Intrinsic Perspective. And I'll just be honest and say that the amount of like immediate feedback and excitement that I get has been vastly greater than having traditionally published a book, despite the fact that it was a wonderful experience traditionally publishing a book. It's been a year now. Paperback is just coming out. I still receive emails about it from people who found it and read it and are like, I've never read anything like this. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. Are you doing a next one? But in terms of like the pure immediate feedback and ease of online writing versus traditional publishing, it means that I think I'm going to do a lot more online writing in the future.
Yeah, there was just so much that a book publishing company used to do for you that now is unnecessary. Like everything, I was actually just did a legacy interview with a guy that his entire career for 25 years was typesetting. And then, now all of a sudden you don't really need typesetters anymore. And then for a while, the book company's job was to get your ideas out to people. But if you're going to get a book deal now, you got to come to the publisher and be like, look, I have 10,000 followers, or I have 5,000 Substack subscribers to even get them to look at you.
Yeah, and I actually have a post coming up breaking down the publishing industry as it currently functions. And one thing to note about it is that it's a number of very hard steps. And the probability of making it past those steps, every one of those steps is quite low. And so I think my suspicion is that, the majority of even good, what one might just consider publishable manuscripts in the United States essentially goes mostly, the majority of it is unpublished. And if you look at like numbers, the same thing that's been happening for movies, like movies are now remakes of remakes. Everyone sort of has experienced this, but you can actually go and look at the top 10, most grossing movies and check to see if they're part of franchises, and you can really see that it's significantly increasing. In literature, there's a similar phenomenon where essentially the rich are getting richer, in that it's a very small number of authors now, smaller than it's ever been, who are making like top 100 bestseller lists. And it's almost always someone who's been there before. And the situation was very different even in like 1980. If you go back to like 1980, you will see that actually a lot of the people making the lists were first time authors. So it's been very interesting to sort of get an exposure to that world. Like the book did well. As I said, I received notes from readers. I'm very happy with it, but I'm also kind of like, well, I'm not sure how this industry is going to kind of keep going. And if there's a huge amount of, doesn't seem like there's a huge amount of energy in the industry right now. Not that there couldn't be in the future, but it just seems that way right now. And to me, it seems like a huge amount of the energy is actually on in writing online, and the ease of it and the ease at which you can build an audience and sort of the power of it. Within 6 to 8 months of writing online, I was be able to like put out a short story, right? Which you would think like a short story, right? Like onto my Substack. And I think it ended up getting like 10,000 views or something like that. And that might not sound like that impressive, but for a literary short story, to be able to do something like that for a literary short story, I mean, outside of maybe being published in the New Yorker, that's about as much as you could possibly expect from sort of the traditional literary industry. Again, outside of the very, very big names. And it's like, okay, so if that's something that I'm able to build that audience within, 6 to 8 months, it seems as if this is where things are going to inevitably move as sort of market forces come into play and as people read more and more on their phones and that sort of thing.
When you go out to buy a book, do you buy it in paperback or you buy a hard copy, or how do you make the decision?
Oh, I love buying hard copies because to me, and this is why I still see a future in books. I'm not one of those people who thinks the publishing industry is totally doomed or anything like that. You know, to me, a book is something that you put into your library, and the library is, and not everyone feels this way, but I very much feel this way. The library is sort of like an aesthetic object, right? It's almost like an art collection. That doesn't mean that every book has to be like perfectly preserved. Most of my books are quite well read, but I like getting the hardcovers because they have pretty covers, and you can kind of line them up nice and so on. So I'm definitely more of a hardcover fan.
I was, exclusively paperback when I was younger. So I grew up in a house where my father collected books. He has more books than Thomas Jefferson had at Monticello. So books were everywhere, and to me, they became almost like tchotchke esque, like where it's just like there's so many books. This is like an incomprehensible problem to most people. But if you've ever lived in a world where your hallways in your old country farmhouse now have two sets of bookshelves on either side, and you're a 6'4" guy like myself, now all of a sudden the house is very small and the stacks of books are everywhere. So I was always like, I want paperback books, and here's why. Because if I love the book, I want to be able to easily give it away, and if I
Yeah.
hate the book, I want to be easy to throw away. And so like the value of having like some long-term thing. But ever since we started this book club, I started realizing like there's actually some books that I want to hold on, and I want to hold on to them for a really long time. So I'd rather have 100 hardback books that I love than thousands and thousands of other kinds of books, like softback or whatever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the book is, books are still just beautiful and gorgeous physical objects. Like, I'm just delighted by the job they did with sort of the cover design and how gorgeous it looks. And it's also something that, like, to be honest, I it's like you can get a million readers and that's fine, but like you can also eventually one day, like my kids will read it, and that to me is like worth like a million readers, right? Because they get an insight onto their dad at like a really deep psychological level that they just would never really have access to. So, and I think that that's sort of the power of the physical book, is handing down an object like that.
Yeah, I feel that deeply with the podcast, that it's actually, if I give all of these away, right? The podcast makes virtually no money, and but like now, my daughter, if something were to happen to me, as long as she's got access to these files, she can see her dad talking with hundreds of people, and that's just something that like it's invaluable to me. The ability to have captured that and pass it on is deeply deeply valuable. So for a book, I think you can imagine that won't just go to your children; it could go to your great grandchildren, right? And still have some relevance to them, and have them some insight into what the world was like back when, what was his name, great granddad, what Erik, what like.
Yeah. Yeah, I honestly think for all the lamentation around cell phones and so on, the amount of data that kids of this generation will have, particularly kids of millennials, will have about what their lives were actually like. Because quite frankly, you don't really remember your childhood. I mean, anyone who really claims they really remember their childhood, it's like those memories are very faulty, very easy to manipulate. Sometimes you remember things people told you that never really happened. And it's also very difficult to kind of figure out what was going on. And I think it becomes easy as you separate from childhood to forget that, like, generally parents love their kids, and and they have to, because that's how you can get through a 3 a.m. wake up, right? And most kids are sort of raised in love in that sense, in that there has to be love there in order for the kid to even like survive, right? And that's something that's really easy to forget as an adult until you have kids. But I think for this generation, they're going to be able to look back and be like, look at all these videos of me. Like, look at the stuff that we did. Look at all these photos of me, right? And it's just they're going to have a sense of continuance about themselves that I actually think will be psychologically healthy. I think it's one of the rare cases of technology really seriously adding something in.
Oh, that's brilliant. See, because when I think about it, I have to resist the urge to try and capture the moments that my daughter has on camera, because I find myself then, instead of looking at Violet, I'm looking at my camera.
Yeah.
And I find that like I want to record everything, but then you think about like, well, how much time will I actually spend going back and looking at these things? And as a parent, you can't even make it to the end of the day. You're lying in bed after your child's asleep, and you're looking at photographs from earlier in the day. So who knows? But it's interesting that you have a positive spin there, because that's my natural reaction is this is negative.
Yeah, I think it's obviously, when you're with the kid, there is always that instinct, but like, I think in the end, particularly for them, it's going to be something that they treasure, like getting that info dump. I mean, we just think about it, like how much delight does the average person get when they're shown a photo of them as a kid? And for like our generation, we get like, some grainy printed out like Polaroid of like, okay, it was me like in a tree. I guess I look pretty happy, and
Kind of looks yellowish now.
yeah, it's like
was
it's
everybody yellow?
faded. But they're gonna get just like high resolution, really really good video, and I think that is actually gonna end up being a good thing. I honestly think it'll be hard to look at your parents when you're 25 and be like, oh, maybe my childhood wasn't the best or whatever, right? And it's like, yeah, but here's like 1,000 videos, and in all of them we're having the best time, right? And I think it's just harder to have that belief.
One of the weirdest things about the ubiquity of photographs and these things is like I have no video or photographs of my dad crying uncontrollably for a completely irrational reason, right? So I grew up, and my knowledge of my father was completely rational, entirely stoic, and as far as I know, he has always been this way since the beginning of my existence, right? Which I don't know anything outside of that. But you also will be able, my Violet's going to be able to pass down to her children photos of her or video of just her being completely irrational. And I wonder if that humanizes them or what that does to that relationship, because it will be different. You've never been able to do this before.
Yeah, I do. I think it'll be psychologically healthy. I think that there's always this sort of like fog of war that surrounds like human relationships. It's like and like and it's really, you have a really tough time about like, what was my relationship to my parents actually like when I was 7 years old, right? Like I have my memories. I have my mother's memories, my father's memories. I have different different stories. Some relatives said different things, right? It's like, so what is that actually the relationship, right? And this is like this sort of amorphous, very difficult to figure out thing, and it allows us to project on our parents sort of masks about often of how we ourselves feel, right? And I think that is harder when you just have so much sort of like actual on the ground evidence of what stuff was actually like. And I think it's good. I think humans are I think humans are very prone to sort of falsification. We're very prone to sort of making up and spinning our own narratives, particularly self-serving narratives. And the treasure trove of videographic evidence will be so vast that I think it's going to be very hard for someone to not understand the complexities of life, right? It'll be very hard for somebody to say like, oh, my mother never really loved me or something like that. It's like, well, here's 1,000 videos of her just squealing with delight whenever you did anything. So it's like, you have to understand that people are multifaceted. And I think that that's healthy in the end.
So we've been talking about memories, but I think it's actually a very interesting thing to ask someone like you. What is a memory?
Well, it's certainly a tough question. I mean, I got my PhD in neuroscience, and I would at varying points sort of ask professors precisely that, right? And for a long time in neuroscience, it was thought that memories were essentially some sort of discrete um, symbol or record of an event that was sort of processed, perhaps in a way very similar to a modern computer. And this is probably the predominant view throughout even the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. Now we have another analogy in neuroscience, and that analogy is of artificial neural networks, which were originally inspired by how the brain functions. So perhaps in a way, thinking about your brain as an artificial neural network is a lot more accurate than thinking about your brain as, say, a laptop, right? Much more accurate and very different. And when we look at artificial neural networks and we look at what memories are, we see that memories are like distributed changes in a vast web of very fine grained connectivity. And pinning down where almost anything is extremely difficult. Artificial neural networks are notorious for being what's called black boxes, in that they work very well often, but no one can really tell you how they work. And that's probably because the input output behavior that they're enacting isn't really compressible in the way that would engender understanding, right? They're not actually just implementing some simple algorithm that you can figure out. They're implementing an algorithm that's as complex as their now trillions of parameters. And the human brain is very similar. We've got trillions of parameters. And what that means is that pinning down, exactly what a memory is or where a memory is in the brain is extremely difficult. I mean, I personally think that neuroscientists, perhaps more standard neuroscientists who are still, very interested in things like what's the biological basis of memory, as if this is sort of like a really discrete question that we can ask with a discrete answer. I think that they're going to end up being sorely disappointed. I think memory ends up being very similar to artificial neural network, where it's sort of distributed across the entirety of the thing. And that's a very that's
Opaque.
I don't I yeah, exactly.
It's very, very fuzzy, right? So because if I think about what you're saying, I'm imagining you saying, well, your memory is stored in your brain somewhere in between the connections between things that happened as your memory was forming.
Yeah,
Is, is
it's like imagine you have the finest interlacing of sort of synaptic branches you can imagine, right? So just this immensely fine complex web, and every perception and experience and at every moment of your life, this web is subtly changing, right? Certain sort of points of contact are becoming stronger or denser, other points are sort of lessening and becoming weaker, right? And this is exactly how like an artificial neural network gets trained, right? It has a huge number of artificial neurons, and those artificial neurons have connections, and those connections grow weaker and stronger depending on how it's being trained. But when you sit down to ask a question like, okay, this is an artificial neural network that knows what a car is or something like that, if you sit down and you ask how does it know that, how does it know what a car is, how does a self-driving car know what a car is, that is a very, very tough question to answer. And that's in systems that we have perfect access to, right? Because you can open up the hood of an artificial neural network and you see this dense cluster of connections, but you have perfect access. Now in the brain, we have terrible access, and it's even bigger, right? So it's like neuroscientists sort of have sort of like the worst of all possible worlds, in that they're dealing with things that probably trend towards being fundamentally black boxes, and are even more difficult to assess and get a handle on than artificial neural networks, where we have perfect access. And this is why I think a lot of neuroscience is noise. I don't think the majority of neuroscience will sort of, particularly like cognitive neuroscience, not stuff about like how neurons work at the molecular level, but like higher level stuff about how cognition occurs in the brain. That stuff gets continuously rewritten every couple of decades, and the reason why is precisely this.
Yeah, I mean, you actually, I was going to bring up the article that you had talked about. about if you tried to push against the standard understanding of neuroscience. If you took something like depression and you said, I think we're over prescribing or we're over diagnosing the number of people that we think have depression, and these are the reasons why, and you kind of illuminated just how difficult it would be to push back on standard accepted understandings of psychology, and then that kind of cascade on, which was like, if this is, well, I'll let you describe it, the article. What were you trying to say in that article?
Yeah, and for those who don't know, so this is referring to an essay I wrote recently for my Substack, and the essay is called "Corporations versus the Demarcation Problem." And the idea is that corporations are sort of now getting into the business, and now even the government getting into the business of sort of regulating what counts as scientific misinformation. But the problem with this is that what counts as scientific misinformation certainly changes over time, and particularly when experts disagree, like not random people on the street, but like an actual expert in the field, and they strongly disagree with the consensus of their field. Within science itself, that should be sort of an allowable phenomenon. And differentiating between when expert level criticism is valid or invalid is something called the demarcation problem, which in philosophy is asking what's the difference between pseudoscience and science. And all the sort of great minds of philosophy, Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolutions, Popper with his notion of falsification, Lakatos, kind of a mix of the two. All these great philosophers never really came up with a very good answer to what counts as pseudoscience versus science and how to adjudicate really fine-grained debates. And therefore, we should be suspicious of asking if a corporation or a government or like a committee can do the same, because it seems as if they have to figure out something that some of the great geniuses of the 20th century really couldn't figure out. I mean, unless they take the more lenient route of saying, we'll only go after the really, really bad cases of it. And that's actually something that I think is fine. But the issue becomes the second you're really talking about, real expert level disagreements where people are citing a lot of research, right? Then suddenly you're getting very close to this question of demarcation about distinguishing science and non-science.
Yeah, and this opened up a lot of concepts for me. So I worked in the biotech industry, in the ag biotech, and basically anybody that came up against GMOs or accepted science, we understand how they work. And if you are saying they're not safe, then you're outside of the consensus and likely somebody that is going to get pushed out of this argument. And you start to think about, like, well, how do you have a discussion where the people that believe, let's say, in the safety of GMOs, how do you create a situation where they're free to be able to explore that they may be wrong without putting the body of work that they've done in jeopardy? Because I felt like when I was at Monsanto, I believed that GMOs were safe. I think that the people that were doing the science thought that they were safe. But like, to even open that door was such a threat to them and their science and their work that the door was just never even cracked open. It would be extremely bad form for people to really entertain those conversations.
Yeah, and I personally I think GMOs are quite safe, but I what I don't think should happen is that powerful entities should essentially if someone came up with like a really detailed, like if someone who was in the industry, say broke ranks, and came up with like a really detailed high level criticism of it. Now maybe this person is totally wrong. That's in fact more than likely, right? That they're totally wrong. But the question is, what do we do with this sort of like scientific monograph, right? That has all the sort of trappings of science, right? It's citing high level sources, it's engaged in in-depth argumentation, right? And then you have to be like, well, I can distinguish between that scientific monograph and sort of like a correct scientific monograph. And it's like, well, under sort of what pretext? Because you're not doing it off of whether or not this person, say, has a PhD in the field, right? That's actually a reasonable criteria, right? If it's a random person on the street screaming that vaccines cause autism and they have absolutely no academic or intellectual background and are not, have no knowledge of the science, then I think we can safely say, okay, this is a very easy case of demarcation. But when we're dealing with cases of, extremely high level, expert level criticism, it seems as if you sort of have to have already a priori solved the problem. But of course, the issue is that these people are criticizing scientific consensus. So you can't simply rely on, well, the scientific consensus goes the other way. It's like, well, but sometimes scientific consensus shifts, and sometimes experts uh, disagree quite extremely with the consensus of their colleagues. And I actually used myself as an example in this essay over a matter that I think is trivial compared to how politicized these debates normally get. And this is that I actually think that a lot of neuroscience, something we were talking about just now, is somewhat bunk. I mean, I think that a lot of neuroscientists are somewhere between just wasting time and like defrauding the public of tax dollars, right? And that's a pretty extreme opinion. Most people in the field don't have that. Like I'm quite willing to say I could very well be wrong. But I think I think I can argue that. And in fact, I'm going to have a book coming out from Simon and Schuster where I talk a little bit about this at some point in the next couple of years, where I talk about sort of what needs to change about neuroscience to get right, and how a lot of neuroscience is not even wrong. Like it's just stuff that's never going to be reproduced. But that puts me in the position of being directly against scientific consensus. I mean, like I'm directly against the scientific consensus, and I think that it would be a mistake to say that some outside forces should sort of adjudicate such disputes, even if no one's suggesting that they are. Right? I'm certainly not claiming that they are. But in terms of sort of like a thought experiment where it seems pretty politically neutral, it seems as if then in this case, almost no one thinks that, like the book that I write shouldn't be published or something like that, right? If I'm just critiquing neuroscience. But then the question is just, okay, so to what degree does politicization sort of change your opinion on that? And I think the answer should be maybe it does, but not like a complete 180.
Well, and your example in that article, all about depression, was actually like I spoke with my wife about it at length. So you basically said, if you wanted to push back on it, this is the criteria. You'd have to have this level of expertise. You'd have to have these counter examples. You'd have to have tried to lay it out. And oh, lo and behold, this guy did that, right? Or the other example, like sleep research. Seems like this is settled, and as soon as people start really breaking into it, maybe not quite as settled as it was before, but there's an entire establishment around people to say, no, we already know what the truth is, and we're not changing it.
Yeah, and I think some of that is that I think scientists are correct to almost never pay attention to what anyone else in the public thinks about their field. I know that that's like kind of that's both elitist and crazy, but science sort of needs to be self-insulating in that way. But on the other hand, there are plenty of times when scientists themselves within the field, like people who have every expert credential you could ever ask of someone, break very significantly right from the consensus of their colleagues. And I think those are cases like when that is happening, it doesn't mean that person's correct. In fact, I think most of the time they're wrong, and most of the time scientific consensus is correct. But they should absolutely sort of be allowed to make that argument. And also, it's very difficult to convince anyone in the sciences of literally anything. It's sort of like steering the discussion on social media or something like that, right? It's like, how difficult is it to steer Twitter? Very difficult, right? Like at most, you can sort of nudge it in certain directions if you're very good and highly engaged. And similarly with science, right? Even if you want to sort of engage and not go to the public, engage just at the level of traditional academic discourse, changing anything within science is very difficult, and all you can sort of do is nudge it along in what are hopefully the right directions. But so I I have a lot of sympathy for people who sort of break with what might be called the expert consensus and sort of make what also might be called an appeal to the public, where you say, listen, I don't take these people too seriously. And that's exactly what, I'm planning to do with neuroscience, which luckily I think no one will get mad at and no one will care. And there won't be any actual sort of political blowback.
I don't know, man.
We'll
You're going to be touching a third. Like I see this go on. So, in the registered dietitian world, or right, where you have these like people that say, hey, we have a license, we understand how this works. But just like neuroscience, I think the science of food and how that all works is ideas stacked on top of ideas stacked on top of ideas, and they're like abstract. And if you looked at any one level, it would you couldn't find any solid answers. And yet when you look at it as a collective, they say, well, collectively we know these things. But if you try and go into the RD world and say even what I've said right there, that I think it is about as much of a science as economics is, right? It's just theory upon theory upon theory. That makes you persona non grata. You're not allowed to be there. And I can't imagine that people that went through to get their PhDs in neuroscience are going to take this lying down.
Yeah, I think the more basic the research gets and the less applied, I think the less sort of like inherently political or angry people get. Like no one really cares if someone else is yelling at physicists about string theory and how it's unfalsifiable, right? It doesn't seem quite that important. I think where the rubber meets the road is that a lot of neuroscience bleeds into psychiatry, and it bleeds into also like how we conceptuate ourselves. For me, the big dark horse within neuroscience is consciousness. We don't have a good scientific understanding of consciousness. We don't know how the brain generates a stream of conscious experience. It seems like the main goal of the brain is to generate a stream of conscious experience for most organisms. That's certainly what our brains spend most of the time doing. And we simply don't have a good theory of that. And so I think there's a very good case to be made, therefore, that neuroscience is pre-paradigmatic in a way that, say, maybe standard, molecular biology is not, in that we have sort of, we know how DNA works and how it gets read, and sort of this the broadest level, the broadest outline. We have those sort of theories, and we have theories like the theory of evolution by natural selection, which explains so much within biology itself, but we don't have a good theory of consciousness. And therefore, I think there's a very good case to be made, particularly within neuroscience, that it's a pre-paradigmatic field, and everyone's sort of just running around like a chicken with their head cut off and sort of doing somewhat random things, and we sort of have this mess of a field as a result.
I actually, so I had Michael Levin on, which crazily enough, we get done with the interview first or second time, and I was like, Michael, you know who you need to meet? You need to meet Erik Hoel. I really would suggest that. He was like, meet him. I was on the hiring committee at Tufts when to bring him in. I know exactly who he is. And I was like, oh. So one of the things that he really has woken me up to in reading his stuff and others is that as a Westerner, we have this very strong sense that causation happens at whatever the lowest building block is that you can find. Like whatever, if you can break a molecule down into atoms, and if you can break atoms down into quarks, and if you can just keep going down, eventually you will reach the bottom. And once you get to the bottom, then you'll be able to figure out the why that constructs all of this. So it's almost like we got to keep digging down. And then once we know that with the furthest down, then we can draw the causation arrow the other direction. And his work, and I think you and him have done a lot in this area. I see these concepts of causation showing up in your writing as well, is that causation doesn't necessarily happen at the base, and it doesn't necessarily happen at the largest macro level. It could be that causation happens somewhere in the middle and goes out in other directions. Talk a little bit about your discoveries of causal emergence and how one thinks in this way, which it's different than our natural propensity.
Yeah, so this sort of little mini growing subfield has an interesting history. My co-authors and I, when I was in graduate school, published the first sort of paper on this. Not really the very first paper, like in the general direction, but in what I think is going to end up being the more accepted answer to these questions about reduction and causation, and so on, which do have bearings on topics that people care about beyond just, philosophy graduate students, right? This has bearings on things like free will and responsibility for your own actions and things like that. And, originally I wanted to do research into consciousness. And what I found is that consciousness is a incredibly difficult question to make scientific progress on. As in, there is a reason we do not have a theory, and that it is incredibly hard. I think harder than even the most high-level theoretical physics to really make any sort of advance in the understanding of consciousness. But we had sort of been developing all these mathematical techniques to think about this issue, and looking around at other problems. There's this question of emergence. How does emergence occur in physical systems? And this is often sort of related to consciousness, but not always. We can think of emergence in a totally non-mental way. And we ended up coming up with some math that we thought well described what was going on with emergence, and countering what might be called the reductionist assumption, precisely what you described, which is this idea that uh, if we ask sort of what's the actual cause of, say, the next state of the universe or your own behavior, right? But whichever, uh, that answer will be down at the level of the smallest microphysics. So it'll be like, well, listen, we had a bunch of atoms and they were bumping into one another, and or the wave function evolved, whatever your final microphysical level is. Maybe it's quark clouds, maybe it's strings, but we had a bunch of atoms that they're bouncing against one another, and then we, as a consequence, we have this future state. And the idea is that, well, essentially everything that's happening is happening simply because of this lowest level of description, and all the higher levels of description, which we think of like chairs and microphones and paintings and us ourselves, are essentially illusory in that they don't actually have any real causal power. They're what a philosopher might call an epiphenomenon. There's sort of like a shadow, or like the engine coming out of the steam coming out of a steam engine. And but it turns out that when you actually do the math on this, it's just not true. You can take a measure of causation, and people have advanced a number of measures of causation across the years, across the decades. People have come up with mathematical definitions of causation, and you can take those definitions of causation and you can apply them in simple model systems where you understand everything. And what you'll find is that under certain conditions, actually the causation will be greater at a macro scale than a micro scale, even for the exact same event. As in, like the coarse grain of a system is better at capturing the causation than some fine grain of a system. And this means that reduction and reductionism is not always the best choice for understanding why or how something happened. Instead, there's sort of like a multi-layered conception wherein generally there's some scale that's more important. Some scales are more important than others, but there's no sort of one perfect final scale like the micro scale. And again, we can kind of just show this directly mathematically. And we originally published this paper back in 2013 showing this, and we used just one measure of causation. But now it's been shown, because you might say, well, maybe there's something very particular about this one measure of causation. Maybe it has some sort of mathematical assumption behind it that leads to this sort of counterintuitive result. And it turns out, no, in fact, pretty much any measure of causation that you look at will give you this result. And almost any conceivable measure of causation will give you this result. And the reason why is that causation is essentially the inverse of uncertainty. And the uncertainty decreases as you go up in scale. And I'll give a very quick example of that. Imagine that we have like Laplace's demon over here who wants to predict what Vance is going to be doing in 10 hours, right? Or let's say 12 hours, right? What is Vance going to be doing, right? And he gets busy calculating all your atoms and exactly how they're going to move. And he comes up with this huge list of very unlikely transition probabilities, where he's like, well, you could be in atomic state 10,591. You could be in atomic state 10,952. You could be in, right? And you imagine this huge list of these possible atomic states that you could be in, and all these tiny little transition probabilities between them, right? But now I come in and I say, okay, but I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to answer it up at a macro level. I'm going to predict that Vance is going to be asleep. He's asleep, right? Okay, well, what's the probability of my prediction? Let's say you're a pretty normal guy, then the probability of the prediction might be that you're almost certainly going to be asleep, right? It's like 95% of the time you're asleep by that time of night, right? Or 99% of the time, or what have you. So what have we done? We've transformed uncertainty into certainty by moving up to a higher level or higher scale of description. And we think that that's what fundamentally underlies this sort of common sense notion of emergence. And it's a very sort of powerful argument because it shows both that that the macro scales of the world, which by the way, most science has to do with macro scales, right? Not microphysics. Cells are macro scale entities, genes are micro scale entities, right? Scientists talk about these things all the time as if they have real causal power. And this shows that they do have real causal power. And the way that they do it is via this sort of noise reduction. And so, in a sense, it's sort of like an unsexy answer, which is perfect because I think that if we had like a magic, if the answer was like there's some sort of magic or new laws or something like that, we should be much more skeptical. But this is a much more sort of like staid answer that's just like, well, it's just about noise reduction, and but it has a lot of teeth as an argument. I think it's very hard to get out of, and I'm also going to be talking about that in this upcoming book, and about how that sort of reconceptualizes our notion both of science and its drive towards reductionism, and also things like free will. Not that I think that it's a perfect argument for like a knockdown argument for having free will, but I think it has it pertains to the debate quite significantly.
I can see that completely, right? It opens up the door to say, because the free will, and I think we've even talked about this in our first discussion about how the argument that people make about, well, it's either you or it's not you making these decisions, it's one or the other, and just how like overly simplified that explanation, that I never feel satisfied when somebody says, no, you don't have free will, you're just kind of you're just sitting behind the camera lenses watching these things occur, and it's actually just a manifestation of randomness and the way your body is going to react. If you put causal, if you can change the causational flow to either go that way or that way, it opens up the door to being a more, I may not have a firmer answer on whether or not I have free will, but at least it opens up the space that makes it feel like a more robust discussion.
Yeah, there's basically two. Well, there's kind of three, but like there's basically two arguments against free will. So the way one should think about it is that everyone has sort of a naive belief that they have free will and are the cause of their own actions. So we should think of free will as like a negative thesis. So we should think of it as, okay, well, what are the arguments against free will? And we should start with those. And those can basically be broken down into two camps. One of which is the could you have done otherwise camp. So it's like, well, could you have done otherwise, right? And I actually think causal emergence, this theory of causation, doesn't have that much to say about that. Maybe it does in like a clever way, but I think where it has a much more obvious impact is on the second argument against free will, which is, well, you didn't really do anything. It was your atoms that did it. Right, you are just sort of you have some microphysical state. That microphysical state is doing things and causing the next future states, and that's where all the sort of the causation is. And so therefore you're not really doing anything, right? It's your atoms that are doing things. And that's a a legitimate sort of argument against free will. But what causal emergence shows is that it's probably untrue. I mean, I try to always be careful. This is stuff we show in simple mathematical models. We don't show it in physics, right? So it's like, well, this argument against free will doesn't apply in very simple mathematical models, depending on some context of how the model actually works. But then the question is, can it actually apply to the real world? If it did, then I think it would, sort of obliterate that particular anti-free will objection. So that's good, right? Like you knock out one of the legs at least, and at least we can sort of be our what might be described as sort of the macro scale descriptions, which we ourselves are. Macro scale descriptions compared to microphysics can be the cause of things, and do have sort of real irreducible causal power.
I mean, the biggest challenge with the shaking up the snow globe by saying, hey, the causation doesn't always start from this reductionist thing, is that then it throws all of the solid answers that you thought you had about the world into question, and then it becomes very difficult to, like, it's a little bit like adding a variable in at the end, and then saying like, okay, now every single equation has to come through with that variable in it. So there is something that feels unsettling about saying causation doesn't run one direction, it could run in multiple directions or for multiple reasons.
Yeah, it's more like causation doesn't automatically uh, occur solely at the micro scale of whatever system you're describing. Macro scale, mesoscale level events in the system can have real irreducible causal power that you can't find down at the lower level scales, despite the fact that those higher levels are completely derivable from the lower levels, but the causation isn't, right? So, um, so within science, the way we should think about that is that actually most of the time, in plenty of system architectures, you don't see causal emergence, right? It depends on how much sort of noise there is in your system and how the system is set up. And so, actually, we what causal emergence says, the theory says, is that we should lean towards reductionism. So, in general, if you don't know how something is working, you should reduce and see if you can sort of take it apart. But it just means that that's not always the winning strategy. In fact, sometimes the sort of the winning strategy in order to understand the causation in the system better is to actually group stuff together and go up in scale, right? It's just that basically more things have to go right in order to move up the scale than down the scale. So actually, funnily enough, despite so a lot of people don't understand this, but that actually means that causal emergence tells us that we should have an inbuilt preference for reductionism. It's just not always true. And I think that that's probably the right answer. Like that seems sort of right to me. It justifies how reductionist science normally is. But I point out all the time that science is actually not that reductionist. In fact, what scientists generally do is they find a favorite spatial temporal scale and think about their system at that scale and don't think about stuff below it or above it. And an example of this would be like neuroscientists trying to understand the brain. What do they look at? Neurons, right? They don't look at quarks. They don't look at atoms, right? They could, right? Like you, like why stop? Why do you stop? Well, why did you stop there? And the answer most neuroscientists can give is like, I don't know, right? But
Well, it's because the human mind can only handle so many details, right? It's
yeah,
like, why does a macroeconomist decide to say that they're not a microeconomist, right? Well, it's because if I try and factor in all those things, my brain will explode, and then I won't feel like I'm making progress. Which there again comes back to my feeling on RDs, which is their philosophy is like, yeah, but if we abstracted it into all of these other domains, whether it's chemistry or biochemistry or anatomy or calories, like the food chemistry, if I break it out so much, then I won't be able to make any progress, and that actually may be what keeps them from making true discoveries that are true over time and repeatable, is the fact that you aren't looking at it big enough. But you can understand the human frailty element of this, of like, well, then maybe that's because the human mind can't handle any more than what it's already digesting.
yeah, and just to say the point you made about, well, it would be impossible for us to sort of model the brain, say down at the level of atoms. That's absolutely true. But I call that like the null model, right? Wherein it all you're actually getting from the higher scale is that, like, okay, well, it's a compression in theory if you were unbounded by computational constraints. The best model of the brain would be down at the level of atoms, and that is what the theory of causal emergence says is actually untrue. There's other benefits than just the compressibility of the system you're looking at. And an example for neuroscientists might be, again, if we think about where causation is the strongest, it might be that at the level of causes and effects, at the level of their interventions, they see a lot more bang for their buck up at the level of cells. And if they started to actually find graining, you would actually be moving away from sort of where the causal structure of the brain is in focus. And in fact, the theory of causal emergence can be used to find good scales of analysis in complex systems, which is something we really need, particularly for biology, where we don't design these systems ourselves. They operate. Who knows exactly how they operate, right? It's very confusing. You might have picked the completely wrong spatial temporal scale to even try to understand this thing at. And that is also what I think happens in biology a lot. And one of the reasons biology is so confusing is that without a good understanding of emergence, without a good scientific theory of emergence, scientists generally just pick some random spatial temporal scale of the system and then sort of analyze that scale. But the problem might be that scale that you're analyzing, maybe causation is barely occurring at that scale. The actual causation is occurring at some other scale, and you're just totally missing it. So anyway, so I think theories of emergence. What I do is I design theories. I mean, that's really my job description. Like theories of emergence should have a consequence. They should be useful. They're not just philosophical. They're useful. That you have to be able to do something with them.
So speaking of your role as trying to come up with these, theories, that you had written a piece on memetics, which I find very interesting. When I first encountered the book "The Selfish Gene" by by Richard Dawkins, I remember being completely captured by this description of memes, and it was well before it had become a part of popular parlance. And so, in his book, Dawkins is saying, let's try and name a discrete idea that somebody can have, and how that idea can replicate. It can be shared and with other people, and it can actually expand. So if I tell 5 people, and then those 5 people each tell 5 people, how that spreads out. And he made a comparison between memes and genes to be able to say, look, they replicate in the same way. They um, uh, end up having disease issues, or start having selection pressure. So some that allow you to do things that others didn't allow you, kind of take on the exact same kind of properties. And I thought it was really interesting when you came in and you were like, yeah, Dawkins did say this and he coined the term, but this was not a new idea. And therein lies this weird thing that's going on, that how many ideas do we have that are actually new and not come from somewhere?
Yeah, it's there's a great line I like to quote involving this, where it's some um, Egyptian from like some ancient Egyptian from like 3000 BC. It's like one of the, or maybe like 2000 BC. It's like one of the earlier known fragments of writing. But in it, they're lamenting that all that is great has already been said, and that there's nothing new under the sun, and that there's nothing more to add, right? And like that's how this scholar felt in like 2200 BC or something, right? So this is a very sort of old conception. I think you're referencing a piece, sort of an exploration I did on my Substack about like who actually invented this idea of memes. And I think we can give credit to Dawkins, because I do think that we should have somewhat loose conceptions of credit, in that not just who says it first exactly, but who says it best first. Right. So if you're the first person to present an idea in its sort of convincing totality, and you give a very good argument for it based off of, arguments that other people have not given, but maybe this idea is somewhat sort of scattered about and you could kind of reconstruct it if you pulled from a bunch of different texts, right? It's like, well, no one did pull from a bunch of those different texts. So I've actually gotten, a bit more like forgiving to thinkers, in that I think now we have to pay attention to sort of the phenotype, not the genotype of ideas, even scientific ideas. And interestingly enough, for Dawkins, there is no good evidence for the mimetic theory of cultural evolution. I mean, Dawkins sort of speculates about this, but the Journal of Memetics, I think, closed its doors in like early 2000s because it never took off as a science. Because what's the unit of selection, right? It's not like with genes where you have a very clear unit of selection. You can track it. In fact, when I was in college, I tried to track memes with a professor, where this was before the internet, basically, where we passed around like a document and had different classes change it and select which of the parts of the document that they liked or didn't like. And the issue is that we ended up with a cool product, but it's like, what was the unit of selection? Like, how can we put some math on that? And we couldn't figure it out. And I think memes are an idea that's like, it's like kind of true, right? Because of course you literally have the invention of meme culture with actual memes that get changed, very much as Dawkins sort of described. But is it really like the explanation for human cultural evolution? I think probably not. But it's the perfect thing for a popular science book, where like it's not true in sort of like the ontological, like academic way, or at least there's no good proof for it in that sense. but it's sort of like true-ish in that it's like a super useful frame for understanding the world, and we should sort of weight that highly. Like it's very nice to get a very useful frame, even if it's sort of like not actually precisely true.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I had that concept of memes, and this was back when I was giving talks to ag groups, and I would stand up and I would put the letters MEME up there, and I'd be like, "Does anybody know how to say this?" And they'd be like, "Memes, memes," right? Like this concept of memes in just that short amount of time. It's probably 8 years ago that I was doing that. Now, if you put that up and asked an audience that, they would think you were insulting them. They'd be like, "What do you mean?" Of course, everyone knows this is a meme, but the power of being able to explain the world through that term is really strong. And it was a little bit earth shaking to me when I was reading your article and you were like, yeah, but Dawkins, this wasn't really necessarily his idea, and we can walk back. But then you also like let this be a larger kind of concept, which was, where do any ideas come from, and what is the value of having credit and publication? For the non-scientist listener, why does credit matter so much to the scientific community and declaring who had what idea, and kind of what were you pushing back on in this regard?
Yeah, so it's of supreme importance in the scientific community, the notion of credit, and often for reasons that we don't want to talk about too much, because I think that it reveals the humanness of science and the fact that science is just as often driven by ego and the normal drives of human nature as it is by some sort of pristine love of the truth that goes beyond any monetary compensation, or anything. It's like, no, like scientists are people, right? They try to have a certain code of conduct and uphold certain standards, but they are just people. And I think within credit, it's actually something I think about a lot. And to be honest, I've never found a good solution of it, because if you're too strict, then you really do hamper originality. Like if you are too strict about accreditation, where you're like, listen, if anybody said anything that even kind of sounds like this at any point in history, you have to find them and cite them, and if you don't, you're in trouble, right? It's like, okay, well, if you
Which
do
is
that,
the experience of grad school, right? You are not allowed to have unique ideas. If there's anything in this review that's your idea, you failed. It's every single idea came from somewhere else, and you better have a little footnote that says exactly where it was.
yeah, that is often the case, um, and so when you present anything in science, you're always extremely trepidatious. Like I put out an article called the overfitted brain hypothesis, which is a hypothesis about why we dream, why dreaming evolved. And I tried to do as much survey of the literature in advancing what I still think is basically a novel hypothesis. But at various points, people have been like, well, this author from 20 years ago has, a paragraph that kind of looks a lot like that. Like, to what degree should we, not that it's at all identical, but if you compiled a bunch of like things that other people said at some point, maybe you could kind of stitch it together into something that would resemble this. And I personally think that that's too high of a standard for people. Like in that case, right, I think I have like 200 something citations in that piece, right? It's like I went through the literature as much as humanly possible, and still I missed a couple of things that, looking back, I'm like, yeah, I wish I had kind of cited this, or I wish I had cited that, or something like that. So that's within the sciences, right? And that's within someone spending a huge amount of time doing a huge literature dive into a subject, and you still feel like you're missing some things. And so I think we have to sort of balance the idea that that if anyone said anything like it, it's not really original, with this idea of, well, we have to allow for production, we have to allow for continuance, and no one has really figured out precisely how to get that balance right. I mean, I think in a way, we all make our own decisions. I've seen some academics go after other academics for plagiarizing them, but the plagiarism it's not at the level of the sentence. It's sort of at the level of ideas, but only if you're sort of magnanimous. Your degree of how magnanimous you are determines to what degree you think that this is plagiarism. And I've seen this happen. And so in the end, I think we make our own decisions about this, and it's always very tough. It's always very tough.
What do you think of the current state of the scientific publishing right now?
Yeah, I think it's the people in it are generally very good-hearted people. The structure of the system is quite poor. I mean, it's extremely expensive to publish an article. It's hard to publish an article. I have some articles that will never be published because I just gave up. And it's always because there's some reviewer who's like, they're not even like, this is wrong. They're like, I want to see this. And you're like, but I didn't do that. I did this other thing. And I can't, this all happened like 2 years ago. I don't remember the code that well. The amount of work it's going to take for me to go in and make this like change that doesn't affect the results or doesn't, affect the thesis is just what you want to see. That amount of work is so vast that it's like not even worth it for me anymore. I think the best thing to happen to science recently has been preprints, where you can put up a paper cheaply by yourself, hosted, and sort of get feedback on it. That's not like reviewers who are kind of making this like thumbs up, thumbs down decision, but just like feedback from the community on it. And honestly, some of the best science occurs via preprints, and this is before peer review, right? Like, so it's sort of shown me that it maybe in some sort of ideal future there, I think there'll always be a place for peer review, but I don't think of it as sort of like the secret sauce of science anymore, just due to the success of preprints.
One of the ideas that you put forward that I think is a little bit countercultural, at least to my audience, is that you think that the lab leak hypothesis with COVID is only 40% likely, meaning that you think that the 60% hypothesis is that it is a zoonotic event. It happened in the wet market or something like that. How did you come to those numbers?
Well, you're also, this is not, it's not like something I've done a deep dive on, right? This is I think that number is in a footnote in a recent essay of mine. So very good eyes. You know, to me, I want to be clear that I have absolutely no idea. Anyone who claims that they have a good idea of what those probabilities are is mistaken. They don't. If you think it's 90-10 one way or another, I think that you are wrong. So regardless of which way you think it goes, if you think it's 90-10, it's not 90-10. It could legitimately be either. And if you look at the early emails, Vanity Fair did a huge piece on this where they looked at Fauci's emails with a bunch of other people. You have a bunch of top scientists starting out thinking that a lab leak is more likely. Even those very same people who later came out and said that was misinformation. And so I think certainly it could have gone either way. The reason why I lean more towards the natural is that I read a paper recently that was doing a lot of modeling work on origin points that sort of pinpointed the Wuhan wet market. But it's all modeling, right? So it's sort of like, as someone who has built very large scale models of the thalamocortical system of the mammalian brain, you can get a model to do anything you want, right? Like I could have gotten my supposedly biologically realistic set of neurons to sort of spell out a name or something, right? Like it was just completely non-biologically realistic things with only very small tweaking of the parameters. So big modeling work is really, really tough. And so at this point, that's all we have. So it was just because I thought that paper was somewhat convincing that it sort of maybe update from like 60-40 the other way to swap them. But
yeah, for me, it's just been very interesting because the people that have a different opinion than the lab leak have like this 90-10 split. And I also know people in the lab. So I had Alina Chan on, I've had Matt Ridley on, who wrote books about this. Like, so, and I can definitely be swept up in the in the vast, the Dunning-Kruger effect, where I'm like, oh, I read this book and now I know a few names, and therefore I'm going to take this explanation given to me and I'm going to put that on the 90-10. I was actually just glad to see somebody putting out an idea that said, I don't know, I'm 60% confident in this idea, because it does seem like all of the ideas are, I'm 95% confident, I'm 99% confident, and I'm with you. When you have that confidence level, you better have a smoking gun. Otherwise, I tend to want the opposite of whatever it is that you think.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, one thing I am still, and one of the reasons why I do have talked about the lab leak on my Substack, I was one of the first, the second that Facebook lifted their lab leak hypothesis kind of embargo, and the second I thought that it was safe for me to even post something, I wrote a post called "Publish and Perish." And it was about virology and about the likelihood of a lab leak, and that even if it ended up not being true, the fact that it could have been a lab leak, like very reasonably could have been a lab leak, should mean that we should be incredibly litigious and on it with contemporary virology. Contemporary virology is a danger. It is a very serious danger, and because this easily could have been a lab leak, and and but I came out with that post like literally like a couple weeks after it seemed okay to talk about it online, and that I was sure that my Twitter wouldn't get. And in the post I don't even say this is for sure true, right? Like I say like I literally could go either way, but that decision I think will haunt the scientific establishment for a generation. The decision to say that it's illegal to discuss that this could have come from a lab when the very top scientists right from the beginning were saying that it was possible. And I think that will haunt us for a generation, because it really severed like public trust in institutions. And I think like reasonably so. Like there was just, even as I said, I actually no longer think it more likely than not came from a lab. I think the other way. But the fact that it was outlawed for more than a year to even say that was absurd. Then
you end up missing the woods through the trees, which is, even if it wasn't a lab leak, the fact that it was so, it likely could have been, it's so easy, and now the entire world knows, hey, these bad things can happen. Existential risk can happen when you think not only that you're doing everything right and you think you're doing everything safe, but you even potentially think I'm doing good by doing this. And I read in a different piece, when you made the concept, you brought up the point of a lab leak for artificial intelligence. And that actually smacked me in the face, because I, up until this point, had been like, artificial intelligence getting out and getting us all, that's kind of like one of those, I'm a non-expert, it's easy for me to feel that there's danger in that, in the same way that somebody's a non-expert in GMOs might be like, well, think about this crazy thing that could happen with GMOs, and you're like, yeah, but the likelihood that that's going to happen is so low, it's not real. But when you did the lab leak hypothesis for AI, I was like, oh, I can feel the way that I did about the virus leaking out, and now I can see this in AI, and it makes me question it in a different way. I thought it was very important that you brought that up.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I never expected in my life, in let's see, I was in college in the mid 2000s. Never would have suspected in my life that we would have AI at the level that we have now. The recent progress in the last particularly just 2 years,
just the art alone in the last year.
Yep, exactly.
Just
DALL-E,
the year. When
GPT.
Deep Dream first came out, I was like, I don't even know what the hell who cares what this is.
Yeah.
But now you look at it and you're like, this is going to completely change the world. This is no question.
People don't. I mean, the human Go champion, I think his name is Lee Sodol. I'm probably mispronouncing that. He was beaten by maybe AlphaGo. I forget the title of it, but he was beaten at Go only in 2016, I think. So in 2016, there were still like computer games with simple rules that AIs couldn't beat humans in. Now an AI can beat a human in any game with any simple rules. like for sure. I think maybe a couple of instances of stuff like poker where there's bluffing that can occur that has been difficult, but they're figuring that out now. And the
I was even trying to think of complicated ones, right? Like a World of Warcraft, right? But
yeah.
you could play it with an AI that has intuitive language understanding that would just wipe the floor with everyone.
Yeah. No, they did it with StarCraft, which is quite a complex game. I haven't played the new StarCraft, but I played the original StarCraft when I was a kid, and like it's quite a complex game. And the AIs now will wipe the floor with the best players, and it's just because there's data available and people felt like doing it. They could do it with anything. I mean, anything that there's data available for. And I think people are sort of unprepared for this world. I'm gonna be having a piece coming out in 2 weeks about AI art, arguing that AI art is not art. Like we are dumb primates, and AI art is the equivalent of like a rock that looks like a face, right? Like you could find a rock in nature that sort of looks like a face. In fact, there's a museum in Japan that collects rocks that look like faces, and they're you just need two holes and like a line, and they all look kind of funny, and they all look like a face, right? But there are no faces in the rocks, right? It was not put there by intention or design. There was no consciousness behind the design of this. Similarly, AI art it's just faces in rocks, but that's kind of terrifying.
That's
that in the
pretty
future,
bold.
yeah.
Are you sure? Like, I mean,
No.
for me, my perspective is that as long as you have somebody putting together a creation of words, like a city of the undead, well, then AI can come back with something that does not look like faces in rocks. It looks like a city of the undead that somebody would have taken the time to paint. And are you saying because there's a human addition into that by creating that phrase, it makes
No,
it not art?
I think it would be absurd. Like it would be absurd to say, for example, if I commission an artist, right, and for my Substack, I don't directly commission him. He basically takes a proceed of the total amount of the Substack, like a collaborator. But I have an artist who's my resident artist for the Substack,
And he
and
does great. The brain massaging one sticks out.
yeah, he does.
Brain.
He's like brilliant. Like I have no idea how I lucked into him. He's so good, and he does these artistic reactions to the drafts. But when he's making the art, he is consciously thinking about something, right? So the result is that the transmission. If we think about art as like a transmission, right? There's a communication between what he was thinking about in his own consciousness and the recipient of the art, right? It's imbued with this. What I would never say is that I'm the real artist because I said, well, what if we did what if we did a City of the Dead for one of these pieces? And he's like, okay, I'll think about it. And then he thinks about it and he does all these things. And then he comes back with this. Then I say, look at this amazing art that I made, right? This is incredible. I'm such a good artist. You'd be like, you're out of your mind. Like he's the actual artist, right? And I think given the minimal amount of input and the ease by which you can prompt these things, I think you're effectively an artist as a commissioner, right? Which most people would laugh at, right? If someone was going out and commissioning artists and then and just giving them one sentence descriptions of what they wanted and then saying, look at all these paintings I made, right? Look at these beautiful hall of paintings I made. You'd be like, you're kind of you're missing something really important here, right? Which is that you didn't make any of these paintings. And I think that Walter Benjamin has this great essay called "Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction," or maybe I'm reversing some of the words in the title there. But this is supposed to be the update of that, where in mechanical reproduction we really did lose something when it comes to art. We lost sort of the originality of it, right? It's like there's a sense in which the Mona Lisa is sort of lessened with every Mona Lisa postcard. Right, it's like the image just becomes, it loses its aura of authenticity and originality. And here, what we're actually doing is severing art from conscious experience. So there's no consciousness behind any of this. It's like unconscious art, right? It's like someone had an epileptic fit and wasn't conscious and sketched something would be the equivalent. And I think that there's kind of a horror to that if you're using it to replace artists. Now, if artists start using it as sort of like a more complex paintbrush where they're sort of testing out ideas and they're in this like relationship with it, and the thing maybe can't do everything, like it still needs like a lot of the fine details, or basically it's just there to sort of be like an assistant, then you're in a totally different world. But if you're just if this stuff gets so good that I can just ask for something and it gives me back 100 amazing things and I just pick out one, then I think that there's a deep sense in which that's sort of like the death of art. It's certainly the death of human art, and we shouldn't pretend that it's not huge corporations that is doing this, right? It's like you haven't replaced. It's not an AI, right? Like it's Microsoft, right? Like that's who you're replacing the artist with.
So there's something in the original description of what you're saying that I really react negatively to, but I think it's probably a definitional issue, because my mentor, the one that really taught me about art, used to talk, well, he still does. He talks about like, one, art is something that makes you feel something. So the recipient doesn't need to know what message the artist was necessarily sending. You're in front of it, whether it's a sculpture or a painting. And just recently, Alex Dodge and I, who's an artist, did a podcast in VR. And you can tell that if you're not really standing in front of Mona Lisa or the Monet's lilies, it's not the same. Even though it's just as big in this VR space, or it's just as vibrant colors, it's not the same. But there's another side of it that Pete was always pushing me on, was to say, he was always saying, he still does, make friends with artists. Artists can see things about culture before other people can. That's why they're there. They are perceiving things that you either can't be put into words or can't be transmitted in a normal frequency. And if that's what you're saying about what you lose, there's this like severing of that connection. I completely agree with it. But it's hard for me, because as the subject, or like as the subjective experience, as I'm looking at art, I can easily feel something that the AI put there because it's arresting. It captures my attention. It's got
Yeah.
nudity, or it's, there's something about that. But I see the severing of the relationship between the artist as harbinger of the future, or somebody understanding what's going on in the current moment.
So I think it's actually both. And I think the thing that you experience is basically the illusion of art. So as a simple example, right, there are plenty of things that make us feel things that we wouldn't describe as art. Even things that are quite beautiful, right? If you saw a photo of the planet Saturn, right, and you said, that's beautiful, that'd be correct. But if you were like, that's art, one could say, you're saying something that could kind of be true, but we're implicitly thinking about some sort of intentionality, like oh, it's art, like who made Saturn, or what were sort of the teleological laws that led to Saturn being so beautiful. You seem to be basically implying that when you say something like that, or if you say this cloud is art or something like that. You could say you're emphasizing how beautiful it is, but if there's really no difference between art and beauty, then we don't even need the term art, right? We can just throw it aside, right? And we should be very wary about the definitions of words that are so broad that we end up not that word not being used or not being meaningful because it's just the same as some other word. But then it's like, well, why did we have this word? It seems like we have it for a good reason. And what Tolstoy has is a modification of this. He has a modification of this principle where it is like the artist experiences something and then creates art, and that art goes out and infects other people with that experience, or maybe almost like a mimetic modification of that experience. So it's like almost like the artist as a contagion of what a philosopher would call qualia, where the artist experiences something and then it affects you, and then that it goes on to affect other people. But in AI art, it's totally one way. So it's not actually spreading. It's like, it's almost like a false consciousness. And I think that does have functional effects. And I think it will have functional effects on art. There's something in movies called imitating the temp. And imitating the temp is something that happens in the soundtrack of movies, where it's one of the reasons why movies sound so bad now often, which is that when the director first makes the cut in the movie, they take music from other movies and they put it into the movie. So like they would take the movie, they have a soaring scene that's very high emotion. So they take a clip from Gladiator and they put it to Gladiator music, right? And they do this, right? And this is how they do the first cut of the movie. And then what happens is that the director grows really attached to the temp, the temporary score, and tells the composer, imitate the temp. Make me something that's as close to it to possible. And that's why movies often, that's why like Jurassic Park sounded so good and so different. And now stuff just doesn't really sound that way, right? It's not distinctive. It's so just bland. And that's how you get these sort of scores, through imitation. Tolstoy called this counterfeit art, which was just imitative art, right? And that's the worst instinct as an artist, is to imitate. Like, don't imitate. And that's what art schools teach you, which is why Tolstoy hated art schools. And I think that what AI does is imitate the temp. It's counterfeit art. It's just mimics. But something that purely mimics can't actually do the thing we want out of art, which is to give us something like original and interesting, and something that's sort of like in a way based on experience. And so I think, the worst thing that might happen, in my view, the worst case scenario, and I'm not saying this will happen, but worst case scenario is that AI art replaces a lot of working artists. And you sort of like have the same problem that you have with index funds, which is that if everyone's buying index funds, and index funds are supposed to reflect the market, how can the market be accurate, right? Because
exactly my point. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about index funds. And I see your point, right? Like if you have a bunch of people playing the tempo, which, I mean, you already have this in pop music, right? There's a whole lot of computer generated pop music that gives you the beat. Maybe if you have the, like, you know, high notes and low notes, and then somebody just comes in and mad libs through it, and you can see that they're like, I don't go to pop music to go find any inspiration anymore. I wonder if I would naturally, just because I'm older. I see your point, and I think that the biggest challenge about art is the demarcation problem, and we're all the way back at the beginning where we started, which is that thing of like, if I say, well, it's something that arrests you, it's something that makes you feel something, you can say, oh, okay, well, then how would you distinguish that somewhere else? But as soon as I start to draw that line, then we start arguing over that line as opposed to the wider thing. And I think that this argument over AI and art will cause very serious complications between people, because the demarcation problem will be even fiercer than it is in science. It probably wider, and because it's so hard and so subjective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is not something that I need everyone on Earth to agree with me about, but I think that it's a really necessary opinion to get out there, because I think that there is a huge risk from, frankly, these corporations automating away human creativity. And I think the worst thing is not. It's much more likely that in that bad scenario, what happens is just that we get a lot of really sort of like mediocre, lukewarm art, and we sort of drive out all the working artists, and we end up with that. Not that we get this like super intelligent, amazing art that the AI, is creating. I think it's going to be like, well, I could either pay a real artist and get something and it'll be really good, or I can, pay Microsoft $5 a month and get unlimited art. And it's like mediocre, counterfeit, lukewarm art, but it's $5 a month and I get as much as I want. And that to me is the more like kind of likely like bad scenario. And I think that people who work in AI very consistently are doing things that are really going to reshape our reality, and they have almost no oversight. And they also, I think, have sort of like the culture and morality all sort of on their side. And I think that if you work on AI, you should feel much more like a nuclear physicist or something, right? Where it's like, you can be a nuclear physicist, right? But if you go to build atomic bombs, don't expect everyone to agree with what you're doing. Like, what you're doing is so morally laden, right? And that's how I feel about AI, is that we should view this as a deeply morally laden and risky enterprise. And the people who get into it and do it shouldn't just be like applauded endlessly for every little thing that they do in the way that the culture, in my opinion, frankly, does right now. I think that they should be interrogated and they should be like put on the coals of like, is what you're doing actually good? Because what you're doing is unleashing forces that are massive in scope and consequence.
And but as a regular person, I mean, most people never encounter anyone that, I mean, you're in kind of a rare air world, right? You know people that are doing GPT-3, same as I do. Actually, the viewers of the podcast would absolutely know people that work on AI, like people like Ken Stanley and Yoshibak is in this world. But it's hard to imagine having, yeah, in our culture, applying any sort of negative label to people that are doing a job.
Yeah,
We don't really have that.
it's well, but I think we do have it, right? Like I was just talking about virology being very dangerous, right? Like as I said, like if you're building nukes for the U.S. government, you should probably expect a lot of people to disagree with how you're using that technology, right? Like that is super reasonable, even if you think maybe there's some reason to have nukes, right? Like even if you think that, it's super reasonable to say that people should expect like some blowback for what they're doing. They're not doing a morally neutral thing. They're doing something that's really morally laden. And so far with AI, we don't have that. Everyone is basically still in the applauding phase. And eventually that applauding phase will end, hopefully. And that doesn't mean that we should stop all AI research or all AI researchers are bad people. It's absolutely not what I'm saying. But I do think that there needs to be sort of like, hey, what's going to be the place for humans here, and maybe you should be really careful about what you create here. And I mean that both from a cultural perspective, but also from an existential perspective. There's a lot of very smart people who, as you say, are concerned about the existential risk that comes from these technologies, and I think that should be taken very, very seriously. And right now, sometimes it gets the feeling of like sometimes it can be like a bunch of rich kids with a bunch of money playing around, right? Not they're grown up rich kids, but like a bunch of people who are now, effectively billionaires putting a bunch of money into this space, and people sort of have unlimited funds and everyone's applauding. And it's like, we need to have a different take on AI by the time that this stuff gets dangerous. We need to have a much more skeptical, a much more hard-nosed take on AI by the time this stuff really gets kicked off.
Yeah, and maybe have the Dune approach where it not only does everybody just eschew it, but it's not even talked about. It's just like, hey, we don't allow this.
That's my solution, but I've tried to pitch that, and not that many people are willing to go along with it, but maybe to some degree.
You just had a son, and he's nearing on a year old. How are you planning to educate this young lad?
Great question. I originally, I myself went to public school. It was not a great experience. I learned nothing. But
you can't say you learned nothing. You're at Tufts University, you have a PhD, and you're all, like.
I was very lucky in that I grew up in my mother's independent bookstore, so I had a massive advantage in that sense. But like an educational advantage. But I really firmly believe that almost everything I know or talk about, I learned mostly outside the structures of academia, right? I learned from reading books or reading papers, or some of like the more high level academic stuff, like going to conferences or doing journal clubs together or stuff like that. But that's very unusual and very like high level stuff. It's not sort of part of standard academia. And my opinions on this, I've sort of become maybe slightly more and more radical over time. Particularly because I recently wrote a piece called "Why We Stopped Making Einsteins" on the decline of genius in our modern times, which I do think that there's at least good anecdotal and then like a little bit of data-based evidence that we just don't have sort of the great geniuses of the past anymore. Maybe that's because ideas are getting harder to find. I certainly think that ideas are getting harder to find. But also, I think that there have been changes to the nature of education. And one of those changes is the decline of the aristocracy and the way that the aristocrats used to educate their children, which was mainly through hiring private tutors who would come and live with the child and effectively educate them for hours one-on-one. And it's the ideal learning environment to have governesses and from when you're very young to be privately tutored, until you're 15, and you go off to college then. And by the way, the college systems at those times, there was entire decades where there were no lectures. at Cambridge University or Oxford University. It was all tutors. So it was all one-on-one learning, even in the colleges. And we simply don't have that anymore. And one reason we don't have it is that it's deeply inequitable, right? I mean, it's insanely inequitable. This was something that was reserved for the very rich, and most of the great sort of minds throughout history were people who were raised in an aristocratic manner. I mean, like certainly, I think it could be argued the majority of them before maybe about 1800 or so on. Were raised in this manner, but there's almost no one who's becoming a really high level intellectual in the 1600s who doesn't have some sort of aristocratic background, like let's say in France. And you know this decline of one-on-one tutoring, which we know from studies to be the most effective method of education, in a sense, we've solved education. We know, like education researchers, we know what is the most effective. We have the studies to prove it. It's one-on-one tutoring, but it's an unacceptable answer because it's so unequal, right? Like you can't go into inner cities and educate everyone via one-on-one tutoring, right? Like there's just no money for that. So everyone sort of has to search for other answers. But if we take that answer seriously, then we should think that there is a sense in which we know what the ideal learning environment is. And now that everything is moving online, and that those sort of forces in our society are much more prevalent, I used to be quite sure that all my kids would go through sort of the normal school system, and now I'm much less sure, and think, well, maybe there's some sort of cheap contemporary way to do something like aristocratic tutoring with kids and give them sort of a structured environment. And I'm not saying that everyone should do this or needs to do this for any reason, but I think it's something that I've become much more interested in just literally since writing this essay, this article exploring this hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, I have found your point on the private tutors to be deeply insightful. So I have been deep diving into everything from Waldorf schools to Montessori. I've toured so many schools in the St. Louis area, like way, way, way beyond what a normal parent probably should. And in large part, it's not because I'm like, oh, I only want the best for my daughter. Of course I do. But my curiosity has been like, just to your point, and I had not taken it to the distance of getting to a private tour, was, all the research shows it doesn't really matter what you do here, because the outcomes are all the same, and they're all the same whether you're doing the European system or the US system. And so I have been boggled, like my mind has been baffled by this, and I certainly have types of schools that I like better than others, but it had never crossed my mind one-on-one. I have toyed with and even approached teachers to say, how much would it cost for you to do 3 students? And I'm just going to have you do these micro pods, because for the amount we spend per student in the United States on education, it can't be that far away from individual private tutors.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing, is that depending on sort of how it's set up, if you think about, private school is $60,000 a year now, right?
If you're lucky.
Now. Lucky. Yeah. So it's like, okay, so that's a salary. Now, if it's $70,000-$80,000 a year, I think I just saw Northwestern University was $82,000 now for its tuition. So private school tends to kind of mirror college. So maybe some private schools are up in the 80s at this point. That's a salary. I have no idea to what degree I'm actually going to do this, or how this is going to be done. But I really think that of all the generations to attempt it, I think my generation is a good one, because we've finally moved to doing so much online, and even like the work from home shift that has occurred during COVID, and the education from home that's been occurring. I think that now is the time to maybe try a little bit more of a radical experiment. And and I also think, like, looking back, in an ideal case, like that's how many of us would like to have been raised, right? Like in this sort of ideal fantasy of having beautiful governess teaches you languages from a young age, right? And then like some hotshot young tutor. Oftentimes these were very famous people, like Bertrand Russell's tutors. Many of them were quite famous. Some were like the graduate student of Lord Kelvin, right, and things like that. That is, I do think that there's very good historical evidence that that's the ideal learning environment, but it's just very hard to replicate nowadays.
And when you think about things like television for your son, how much screen time has your son had in total? Any
So
idea?
far, none, except sometimes when I'll have something on and he realizes that I have something on and he like comes over and he's definitely seen the TV on, he sees us on laptops and computers, right? There's no way sort of around that. He certainly doesn't have his own devices, and won't for a very long time if I have anything to say about it. So I don't think that just like seeing the TV does any, there's no good evidence that just, having a TV on occasionally in the background, if they're not just like sitting there watching it, really does anything to them. I'm very concerned about it because I think that that period of time, particularly as you get older, in like maybe 6 to 10, in terms of the amount of imaginative play that children should be getting, should be very high. We know that that imaginative play correlates to like everything good you can think of, right? So the more imaginative play that kids get, the better. So I actually don't think that screens themselves are that negative. I think it's more so that it replaces other time. So if I had to guess, my guess would be that some of the negative effect of screens comes from just simply replacing time, where the kid would be doing imaginative play somewhere else by themselves.
Yeah, the best. So Violet has seen virtually no screens other than like whatever she incidentally sees. But like we've never even watched TV around her. I don't watch that much TV to begin with. But the thing that I have observed is that she demands to go outside all the time. And I think a lot of parents, like when we've had friends over or even family, like Violet, it could be like sleeting outside, cold and wet, and like she has no knowledge that that's not what she wants to do. So if we'll put a coat on her and let her go outside, that she is like every ounce of soul in her is pushing to get outside. And I think that that's been the biggest benefit from not having TV is she doesn't use her limited little girl, like I'm going to make demands power to get the TV on. She uses it to go outside. And that seems to be like a cycle. And I think that that's, for me, it's less about, is she going to get addicted to it or any of those things? It's that I don't want her to want to see what's on there. And that's been the most important thing.
Yeah, I've like my suspicion is like, because sometimes I'll look over, right, and he's like looking at what I'm doing, but he almost always gets bored and looks away because I'm like typing something, and it's just not actually that interesting. I don't think just seeing like the light from the screen is going to do anything. And then also, and in fact, I have an essay coming up on this, on the intrinsic perspective. One thing that I've actually gotten into recently in terms of occasionally having something on in the background is esports, which I think are very interesting. I was never into esports before this.
These are people playing video
games professionally. There is a whole universe. I discovered it like last year. I was like, what is happening here? There's like casters, there are teams, people get signed. There's like drama about, who's the best. It's exactly the same as the regular sports world. But what I like about it is that, that most of the people who do it are also sort of personalities, and you actually get to know them a lot better than sort of like the blank-faced players who you never really get to know well for regular sports. Like I don't think any of us really even know Tom Brady well, despite the fact that he's the most famous sports figure. I mean, I think we would all sort of be shocked if we privately spoke to Tom Brady and he would come off as very different. But that's very untrue for this esports world. But my point being here is that in esports, it's not like a talking head, right? It's like someone playing a computer game or something. And so kids just they can't even see anything interesting in it. They don't even look at it. Like because it's not because if it's a head, like if you put on CNN, even the youngest baby will be like, "What is this huge talking head?" That's in front of me.
Yeah, faces. I mean,
Yeah, the
kids are
second,
just so
but if it's
primed
like
to see
little
faces.
figures, moving around on CNN, they're like, "Whatever, I'm done with this. I'm going somewhere else."
Yeah,
So a little
like for
secret
me,
to watch sports is that you can't watch regular sports, but you can watch esports because they'll just get so bored of it.
my observation is that Violet is now she's 22 months, so almost 2 years, and I was just telling my producer Ben Anderson, like one of the great joys about parenting that nobody tells you about is the moment when your child sees something that you didn't notice. And we've had a couple of experiences. Like the other day, she starts yelling, "Turkey, turkey, turkey." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And I look outside, there's a wild turkey in our yard, right? And so, like, you're like, okay, she saw that. I was looking outside at the same time and couldn't see it. And this morning she saw a turtle. And like, I don't know that I have ever found a turtle out in the wild. And
Yeah,
she's
that's
like, "Hey,
impressive.
look at here. This is a turtle." And for me, like, there's something truly, I don't like human that you couldn't experience if you've never been around a child that you raised from nothing. You knew that she did not have the word for turtle before we taught it to her, exposed it to her, and then she found a turtle. There's like a circle to this whole thing that is impossible to explain to other people. You can only experience it.
Yeah, there's no greater. There's a famous philosophy of mind thought experiment called Mary, the color scientist, and in the thought experiment, it's a neuroscientist named Mary who knows everything about color vision, but has been raised in a black and white room. And the question is, does she know what seeing color is like? Because she knows all the physical facts about the brain that involve color vision. So if the physical facts of the brain determine the color experience, then she should understand color. But does she learn anything new? Is she like, "Oh wow, that's red"? Right now, I've seen red for the first time. And the intuition is that she does experience color for the first time and has like a reaction to it, and that's not covered, right? So it's an anti-materialist argument. But in general, the difference between experiencing something and then having sort of like heard about it, right? There's that gap, and I think parenting is one of those the places where that gap is the largest, where you just you basically you experience it, but it's so actually difficult to put into words and to express it. And you would think that that is absurd. You would think that everyone has a good understanding of what it means to be a parent because we've had so long to tell people about it and to communicate with it. And every single person is like, "Oh, this was like so much more sort of like interesting and evocative. And there's all sorts of stuff in here that I wasn't expecting at all." And it's like, okay, so clearly we're just sort of dumb primates, right?
Well, and so this goes along with a game that I play with Violet. So from a very early age, I have a like an acute sense of smell. I can like read a recipe, and you can add spices in, and I can accumulate what those spices will taste like, but I'm not sure I can evoke the smell of something. And so I knew I have this plant called a Korean spice viburnum, which is this beautiful smelling plant, and it's got two different smells. In the front end of the smell, it's like perfume, and in the back end of the smell is like a spice, like nutmeg or cinnamon or something like that. So it's two different like. And before the flowers came in, I was trying to explain to Violet, way beyond words that she could use, can I put a smell into words such that she would not be surprised by how it smelled? And this has been a wonderful exercise because it has forced me to, like it's very difficult to backwards engineer a smell. Like, what does it
Yeah.
smell like? Right. I can only give you analogies, just like, oh, it tastes like chicken. Right. Like, and then to be able to put that into words and then to like see her experience these things, it's been a very it's almost like meditation where you're like, I know I can't get there, but the act of trying is
It's
probably the most
interesting.
valuable
Yeah.
part of it.
Yeah. That's great. I love that exercise.
So, Eric Hoel, you are the most prolific writer I know. I'm sure you have 1,000 things to do today. I'm so excited that you took the time to come read it. If people wanted to read your Substack, find out more about you, where would they go to do that?
Yeah, so if you just type in Erik Hoel, Erikhoel, into Google, my Substack should be one of the first results. It's called The Intrinsic Perspective. It's the best way to stay in touch with me. It's also a great community over there, and I also don't bug people. I put out one essay a week, so you get one email a week, and I really try to respect people's time and only put out sort of stuff I'm really confident in. So that's how you can find me.
It's brilliant stuff. Any of the articles we've talked about today or any of the forthcoming ones that come out there, I have never read anything that I have not been like, huh, that's an interesting, oh, that's surprising. I find it a wonderful thing to grapple with. So, Erik, thank you so much for your time. We'll have you back on soon.
Thank you so much, Vance. It's been a pleasure.